Well, good evening, Ron. Ron, you're still actually, I think you're still muted, my friend.
I was saying all kinds of cool stuff as well too. I said hello first. I will tell you that, and I was going to say it also must be Monday because you and I are sharing the video screen at the same time.
Yeah, it is indeed Monday Night Monsters, folks. So welcome back. It looks like we got a few folks. Hey, Michelle, I heard that you needed to hear this, so that's a very exciting thing. Glad to have you aboard. And we have a pretty exciting show tonight, I think.
If at any time, and I will just put this out right now, if at any time either one of us become possessed during the show, because you know that that can happen, I have my Latin prayer book over here now. It's going to help if you get possessed, but it's not going to do me any good whatsoever. So I suggest you have something up on the screen in case that happens.
Of course, of course. But please be aware if you do decide to exercise me that possession is 9/10 of the law, and I'll get my lawyers on that. So.
That's awesome. That's awesome. You know, exorcism and exercise sounds so alike to me that my body would reject all forms of either or. So
Possibly I'd get abs, which would not be such a bad thing. So.
they're demonic abs, man.
So yes, we're going to be poking the bear or poking the hornet's nest a little bit tonight because we're going to be tackling a topic that is very controversial, and I believe that a lot of people have very, very strong opinions about this. And here on Monday Night Monsters, we have never been afraid to sort of get a little bit intense, get a little bit controversial, and maybe tackle some ideas. And I think that one thing I always like to point out about our show is that we're not here to debunk anything. We're not in the business of debunking. On Monday Night Monsters, one of the things that we want to do is sometimes peel back the misconceptions, peel back the layers of misunderstanding, usually by going back to the source, because I think, as you all must realize, that over the course of the centuries, beliefs, perspectives on things, and the origins of things have changed, and so people's perspectives about topics, what they are today, what they were 100 years ago, what they were 1,000 years ago, they do change and they do evolve. And one thing we think is a good idea is sometimes to go back to the start and find out where something came from, so that we can come forward with a better understanding.
Excellently put. Now, before we begin this show, which, in case people haven't figured out, is indeed on demons, let me just ask you a couple questions.
Of
The
course.
first question I have for you is why are demons so popular now? Like, what do you think is part of this cultural milieu that so supports this attraction to the demonic?
Interestingly enough, I'm not sure that demons are more popular now than they ever have been. I think that what we have today is the forefront of paranormal investigation in the public eye. And because paranormal investigation is so public now and is such a public form of, let's be honest, such a public form of entertainment, I believe that the resurgence of interest in demonology and sort of demonic activity has just cycled back through. Because one of the things we're going to talk about tonight is how the sort of fascination with the demonic has basically gone through cycles and been a big part of culture at a lot of periods in our history.
I'm looking forward to this show.
So yeah, before we get started, just a quick note. Of course, I think we should address the idea. Oh, there's Chernobog, of course, which I'm sure you all remember from Fantasia, probably one of the most exciting demons out there. But I think we need to at least address, before we get started, the topic of what a demon is, at least the way we perceive demons. And I think that the most common perception of a demon in a modern context would be a malicious, non-human spirit. That's something that's got that term, non-human spirits, has gotten a lot of airplay in the last few years, or entity which preys on human weakness, feeds on fear and despair. And to follow up with that, I believe that almost universally they held a religious context. Modern lore associates demons with possession and with disease very commonly, and originates with a distinctly religious cosmology, especially Christian belief, although having echoes in other cultures. And so that's the baseline that we're going to start with, but we are going to be winding back the clock a little bit to see how that idea of demons came into existence.
Absolutely. I will tell you this, though, and I'll put this out as a little bit of an asterisk on that. The definition you gave for the demon at the outside of the show also applies to my ex-wife. So not all of these things are.
I've got a few exes that qualify as well, and occasionally a little bit possessed. So
it is.
All right. So I think we should wind the clock back a little bit and sort of look at where, in fact, maybe this concept did start out. And so if we go back a few thousand years to the Middle East, we have something that is called a jinn. And Middle Eastern cultures had myths of these jinns, powerful spirits capable of both good and evil. And of course, if you're not already familiar with this, the origin of the word genie, because the pronunciation would probably have been a little closer to genie or genie, is what we see. So the genies you see in Aladdin or in the Arabian Nights or even in horror films that appear from time to time are based on this Middle Eastern concept of the jinn, these sort of intermediate spirits, which is a concept that's going to come up a little bit later as well. But they were dangerous and unpredictable. They could be called on by humans who could basically summon them to bring fortune or exact revenge. And so these were these very, very powerful spirits, but spirits also that were neither good nor evil specifically, but really took on the aspect of the person who summoned them or the circumstance that they were in. And they were something that throughout Mesopotamia and Sumeria, or these jinn spirits were a common belief, a common kind of a lesser god, I suppose. They were like an intermediary form of spirit.
We can definitely see that they came out of some sort of a nature context. We know that they, had some sort of elemental spirit to them. Initially, the jinn were said to have been originated from smokeless flame. So you have this idea of fire, which of course is going to be borrowed later on to represent the demons that are in, perpetual burning within the flames of hell. So yeah, it's very interesting to see how this all starts because, as we always say, history does not exist in a vacuum. So all of this had to come from someplace. And even though we're not calling it by name now, or most of us aren't calling demons by name, that's still part of the idea that crosses cultures with it, right? So it still has that background, even though we're not aware of it, it's still there subconsciously to us.
And actually, Sarah, you're quite right that they are mentioned in Islamic Genesis. It's an Islamic concept at its core, and that's the cradle of civilization. Something that I think a lot of people in the Western world sometimes forget is how much of everything we consider civilization actually began in the pre-Islamic world, in the Middle East and these ancient cultures. And so much of what we have today, even including our culture, our religion, and our language, has some kind of a genesis in that part of the world. I mean, it really is the cradle of civilization.
And even though we joked about, I'm sorry, I was just saying, even though we joked about exorcism at the outside of the show, I also have to point out that the jinn were very feared even before the Islamic culture took over. The jinn were so feared there was, exorcism tablets that were written to keep these kind of things at bay. And by the time that the language and the religion and the dogma of Islam comes into play, then you see whole tracts dedicated to the expulsion of these things from your house. So the idea of these things being able to enter into the human body, this idea of possession, is quite ancient.
It is indeed. Now, Greek culture, Greek and Roman culture, which was rising at that time and sort of ended up becoming kind of the genesis for a lot of what Western culture is today, intermingled quite a bit with these ancient Middle Eastern ideas. And they began to adopt the idea of these sort of jinn as well, although there was another word, the Greek word for it was daemon, or daemon with an A or daemon with an I. And these were basically, this concept is exactly where we actually get demon from. But the Greek term was for an intermediate spirit, which I had mentioned earlier. These spirits, which basically were not quite gods. They weren't powerful enough to be gods, but they were intelligent. They had a certain amount of free will, and they were much more powerful than humanity. And so even in terms of the humans being earthbound and gods being in this kind of distant heavenly place, that even the existence of demons was meant to be intermediate because they were considered to be elemental, exactly as you said, but in a way they were the spirits of the air. They existed in that sort of ether between earth and heaven. And so they very much were not just intermediate in terms of their power over human kind in the human world, but also intermediate in terms of what role they served. They were the bridge between us and the gods. And that's an interesting thing because that's something that we see in not just demons, who are meant to be, I guess, in popular culture, we now see them as intermediates between humankind and the ultimate evil, the devil or Satan or whatever your sort of great evil force is, but angels being the intermediate force between humankind and the divine. And the idea that both angels and demons are effectively in these ancient times the same thing, depending on their sort of demeanor, is something that I think that a lot of people forget. But sorry, very itchy eye all of a sudden. So the Greeks again came up with this concept, or gave a name to these daemon, and that daemon concept was very inhuman in a lot of ways. These creatures were a sort of a merging of human and animal ideas. So they were never portrayed as distinctly human. They were often shown with aspects of both animals and humans, and of course they could be helpful or malicious. But as you mentioned, there were tablets and there were spells, there were household charms that were dedicated to them, and when people wanted ordinary things that were sort of not, great, crop, the crops or the fortune of the world, but rather ordinary day-to-day things like good health, or, to have a child or something like that. They wouldn't be praying to the great gods. They would be praying to these intermediate spirits, these jinn or demons, who were the creatures that dealt with ordinary human affairs.
Yeah, the gateway or the conduit between two worlds, I guess, is the way you would look at it, which is one of the reasons why by the time we get to the Middle Ages, that not only are angels represented with wings, but also these demons or the demonic, because it shows that they can transcend worlds, which is very, curious whenever you look at the iconography, and some of those pictures that you showed there as well too, showed these things with wings. But as you said, and the thing that we have to point out here is that initially the daemon, at least in the Greco-Roman world, before Christianity took over, they were ambivalent, right? They were not necessarily good and not necessarily evil. They were just something out there that was part of the environment. And because they had such an elemental aspect to them, just like nature, they can be chaotic. Sometimes they can give and sometimes they can take away.
And while we're only right now speaking about the sort of Middle Eastern and moving into Near Eastern and Western culture, analogs of these creatures existed in just about every human culture, because we did all ultimately spread out or fan out from a central area. And so ancient Egypt, ancient China, places like this all had their variations on these things by different cultural names, but the concept was essentially still the same. You had your great and powerful sky god, who rarely had direct interaction with humans. You had usually your sort of great evil or pantheon of evil, because different kinds of religions saw gods in different ways. Some of them had, a huge pantheon of gods. Some of them had more sort of centrally focused gods. But you had your great evil god, or evil sort of force of nature. You had your great sky god or force of nature. And then you had all of these spirits that existed within. And those were the ones that primarily interacted with humankind. But but it really came in the rise of Judaism that we began to sort of crystallize the idea of what these demons were in a little bit more of a modern context. And few centuries before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, the Old Testament had been translated into Greek for the very first time, what's called the Septuagint. And this earliest Greek translation is one of the actually oldest surviving translations of the ancient Greek scripture. Ancient Jewish scriptures, contains a lot of books that we don't have in the modern Christian Bible. It contained books about sort of the apocalyptic end of creation and all these different things. And it had a lot of rules and things that they were taking the various concepts that were sort of crystallizing into becoming Judaism, and giving them a little bit more form, giving them rules. And this is the first place that we actually begin to see a distinct division between angelic entities and what they called daimonia, which were the gods of other cultures. They actually believed that the gods of other cultures were specifically demons. And this is the first time that the concept of demon was particularly applied to a creature which was meant to be evil. And this was the first culture that did really specifically differentiated between what an angel is and a demon is, and assigned them different perspectives.
And ordered them as well, and gave them the nature of good and evil, depending upon what class they fell into. And without that kind of classification, you would not have that development that we see within the Renaissance and starting in the Middle Ages, with the idea of John Milton's Paradise Lost, in which the Satan figure and all the demons that surround him in his court are all named after Middle Eastern gods, which is very curious. I mean, because we're dealing with something that's a few thousand years old that extends clear up to the Middle Ages, which is very interesting.
In fact, in a minute or two, I don't want to jump ahead too quickly. I'm going to talk about the sort of hierarchy of these celestial beings that was a part of medieval belief at that time, and the fact that both Milton and Dante had a great deal of influence on that when they created their epic poems, which explored the idea of the sort of world beyond, the afterlife, inferno, purgatory, etc. But just a quick note to sort of follow up on the idea of this sort of Jewish, literally demonization of these jinn or daemon characters. Is once seen as neutral forces, they were now specifically designated as openly evil. And the two figures represented here, one would be the figure of Pazuzu. Now, Pazuzu was an old Mesopotamian wind spirit, and as with any other sort of secondary or sub-god, sort of a lesser god, it had dominion over specific things. And while it was a spirit of the air, it was also the spirit of disease. And the Judaic people, the Hebrew people, thought that this clearly would associate it with evil. And so Pazuzu became known as a demon, specifically an evil spirit. And the other one here, which is well known in ancient texts, but also became very well known to the Hebrew people, was Lilitu, or Lilith, the consuming spirit, who again once considered a spirit of the underworld, but eventually became this consuming spirit. And we talked a lot in our vampire episode about the way that that this character of Lilitu, or later Lilith, would end up becoming sort of boiled down to one of the more rudimentary concepts of a vampire in later folklore. So you can see that these creatures are being evolved as the centuries go by, and slowly they're being diminished and turned from something where once they were demigods, then they became sort of micro spirits, and then eventually become almost like sort of predatory creatures with no particular identity of their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like Sarah just says right there, of course, now we start seeing them coming into popular culture, right?
Absolutely.
Now they become the foils in our horror movies.
And Pazuzu, of course, a lot of people, it's interesting, Sarah, you mentioned The Exorcist, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But The Exorcist, of course, we have a tendency to generalize a lot of things, especially this is true in America, where we tend to think that everything from outside our culture is somehow summed up by our own culture, which is a little bit on the arrogant side. And I think that as Americans, we have a tendency to do it, by default. But we frequently refer to the movie The Exorcist as about a little girl possessed by the devil, except the devil in the film is actually represented by this spirit Pazuzu, which has nothing to do with the Christian devil, and in fact existed long before the concept of Christianity was given rise to, and long before even the Hebraic version of Satan or Lucifer, these devilish concepts grew. So it's interesting that we do that all the time. We tend to assume that one thing from another culture is simply a reflection of something from our own culture, which is funny considering how comparatively young Western civilization is by comparison to some of these older civilizations. And so our culture is not, their culture is not a reflection of ours. Our culture is a reflection of theirs. And our devil is a later version of some of these creatures, obviously not the other way around, but a very good observation though. So, in the medieval era, because we are jumping forward a little bit in history here because things didn't change all that much, but I apologize. Actually, we're going to talk about one of our famous biblical stories. Now, a very, very common idea in the Bible is the idea that Jesus would cast out demons. And one of the most famous stories, and one that gets a great deal of airplay, is I believe it's called the exorcism of, let's see if I'm reading this correctly. I believe it's the Gerasene demoniac, and that means a possessed person. So there was a man who was possessed, and Jesus came to him and was going to cast the demons out of his body. And when he asked the demon what its name was, the demon specifically said, my name is Legion, for we are many. And it turned out that he was not possessed by a single spirit, but rather a host of different spirits. And that one line, that concept about my name is Legion, for we are many, gets so much airplay in fiction, in fantasy, and it's probably the single most well-known biblical demon is this concept of Legion. But he exercises these demons and makes them all pass into a nearby sort of a herd. I'm not sure if herd's the correct word, but a group of pigs. And the pigs then all run off of a short cliff and into a lake and drown themselves, which I have to say, from a theological standpoint, I can't imagine that drowning would have killed the demons, unless they were bound into the pigs' bodies. But the idea is allegedly that this would have defeated the entire horde of demons. And so that is one of the most popular biblical stories, but it's also where we start to see demons really coming into their own in Christian mythology, is in that early story about Jesus.
Right. And if we look at this from a religious point of view, it's interesting that the Jewish Jesus casts these demons into the unclean animals of their culture as well too, and it seems that the animals drown themselves simply because they could understand the significance of the evil that had possessed them, wherein mankind cannot. So it's almost like without we don't have the reason with which to counteract these things. But yeah, very interesting. And again, because none of this exists in a vacuum, we can see the single story that we have in the New Testament drawing from different traditions.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, there are biblical scholars who have tried to use this story to argue different parables from it, including the idea that Jesus casting these demons into these pigs and allowing the pigs to kill themselves was somehow a way to advocate for the idea that human life was the only valuable life, and that the pigs' lives were expendable, that we have no obligation to animals. So it's a very strange, sort of a philosophy that sometimes people use to try to impose their values or their perspectives on biblical stories. But obviously, that's something that we see pretty frequently. So let's see here. So as early Christianity grew out of Messianic Judaism, because of course Jesus was not a Christian, Jesus was a Jew, but in the wake of the cult that arose around Jesus and following his death, this Messianic Judaism, which considered Jesus to be the literal embodiment of God on earth, did begin to grow, although it certainly did so very slowly. But as its cosmology evolved, the idea of demons grew and developed into an ever-present peril, which could only be fought by the church. And this marks kind of an interesting change in Christian theology versus the theology of some other religions and faiths around the world, because a large number of world religions have this idea that the gods are there to be appeased, but that if you appease the gods, that you will have a good and prosperous life, and that if you don't appease the gods, that misfortune will follow you. But in the Christian belief, it began to evolve into this sin-based economy, I suppose you could call it, where mankind couldn't get the grace of God without constant obedience to God, without constantly sort of sacrificing to God. And there had to be this constant payback for this eternal level of sin that supposedly was there. And that if you didn't do so, that you would be harassed by demons, possessed by demons, and that the devil was actively out there searching to possess you, to corrupt you, to tempt you. And that's not something that was a part of most other religions, but it was this whole change in perspective that ended up overrunning, I would say, and really changing the perspective of the Christian faith very
Absolutely.
early on.
And another interesting thing to point out as well too is that demons aren't only going to make your head spin around and levitate off the bed. They're also the bringers of sickness.
Yes.
So if somebody's sick, there's a demon in them, right? Mental illnesses was seen as a form of the demonic. So now anything that's wrong within the cultural scenario of your time is blamed upon influences by demons in one way or the other. So it was all pervasive. It was everywhere you looked. And like I said, if you were physically ill in some way, or if you were deformed in some way, oftentimes that would lead back to you were being possessed by something. And we do see that in the New Testament as well, that Jesus actually does exorcise demons out of people and people become physically well again. And another thing is, during Jesus's time, there were a lot of exorcists out there. We know this, So it wasn't just Jesus was going around the Holy Land, driving out demons. This was almost a business at the time because it was all pervasive.
Well, this is very true in religion in general at that point, sort of this, again, this evolution towards this messianic religion, and the fact that you did have to buy, in a sense, your way into heaven with,
Right.
whether it was with tithing to the church, whether it was through good deeds, whether it was through, any form of sort of appeasement of God. But the idea that the church did become, in a way, commerce based, and it's not meant to be offensive to anyone who's out there. Again, we're not in the business here of of trying to sort of frown on specifically any one world culture, but the church is not the same thing as the faith. The church is the human element that rises up around a particular faith. And as the church found that it became empowered, and priests, the clergy, the sort of hierarchy of the church became empowered by this. This was a power that was like royalty. They became essentially royalty. They had political power, they had wealth, and this was all coming from the common people. But most ordinary people are not particularly willing to give up a large portion of their wealth, give a large portion of their money, to give their best livestock or anything else away for no good reason. So the only way to keep people in line was to have an ever-present threat that they had to fight back against. And this threat of the satanic, the demonic, these forces of darkness that were constantly knocking at your door was an excellent way to keep the people enthralled to the church. And so this, again, this demonic commerce idea, it began to grow and really took hold in the early Christian church. And it was the idea that the average people had no power, that the average people could not fight back against Satan on their own, that they required the church. They were the only people who had the power to fight back against these dark forces. And it really empowered the church, unfortunately, to have a iron grip on the people.
Right. So as Lord Acton said, power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. We do see that happening. And we're definitely going to see this by the time that Martin Luther nails his thesis on the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral in 1513, or in 1517, I'm sorry. But getting back to the idea that, and this is not naysaying on a religion, but we do know at the time of the Second Temple period within Jerusalem that the main commerce that was being brought in was that of animal sacrifice, right? So the major money that was being brought into Jerusalem at the time was in that way to appease God, so he doesn't become angry with you, and not only to appease God, but something to take your place as your sins. Your
Right.
sins are forgiven because you sacrificed an animal. So it was that idea of get this out of here in a way, but of course it was controlled by the church, which, well, by the synagogue, we should say, by the temple. But yes, we will see that develop further as we go into the Middle Ages.
An interesting kind of an offshoot from this, and it's something that I hadn't really planned on talking about, but you just mentioned the idea of being able to like pass your sins on to someone else is fascinating. Is around this era that the concept of the sin eater emerged, and this is such a fascinating cultural survival that actually made it into, I think, probably the 18th or even maybe early 19th century. The idea that particular people within a community, or sometimes a given individual, usually somebody of low means, the lowest of the low, would offer to take your sins on, usually for a small payment of some kind. And they were shunned by the community. But when a person died, the corpse would, of course, have the person would have sin left over, and you would want your loved one to go on to to a final reward in heaven. And so you could pay the sin eater to come and actually consume bread which had laid overnight on the corpse's chest, meant to absorb the sins of that person so that they could go up to heaven and be pure. And what a truly bizarre concept this was. But the fact that not only that it ever happened, but it survived so late, especially in European history, and the concept that almost every village had a sin eater that would offer to do this. And so I can imagine that they didn't have a very good future ahead of them if they'd consumed all the sins of the village, and probably no one was willing to eat the sin eater's sins at the end. But it's such a fascinating little bit of culture there.
I do agree. I think that it went up until the Victorian period. I really do think that I remember reading accounts, even in the Victorian period, of this happening.
Yeah, again such a very, very strange survival. But it's the whole idea is the concept of sort of sin and redemption had grown to be such a huge part. I mean, no
Right.
longer was the sort of beneficence or grace of God a huge factor in your life. It was something that you had to literally claw and scrape for the grace to make it past the pearly gates and get into your final reward.
Right. Because this now becomes the scapegoat, which somebody, I was just going to bring that up, which Sarah just brought up, the idea of the scapegoat, something that is taking our sins, taking it away from us so that we cannot have to suffer for the transgressions that we committed against God.
And Sarah, you just mentioned Baphomet, which is, of course, one of the old demonic forms that's seen in medieval religion, and all of these demonic figures from ancient from medieval sorcery and medieval philosophy were largely sort of perversions of earlier pagan ideas. The idea of sort of goat figures like Pan or Cernunnos from old pagan religions had been incorporated into what ended up becoming medieval sorcery, which was actually the next topic we were going to jump into.
Yeah.
Because this powerlessness of the average person in the face of God was something that there was a certain class of people who were not willing to accept. And so the idea was that there were men who wanted to have power over these ideas. And so this was the birth of medieval sorcery, effectively. In the Middle Ages, there were philosophers and scholars who believed that by using ancient languages and complex sigils and things like that, that they could actually enforce their will on the gods instead of the other way around. And much of what survives today as our perspectives on things like black magic, witchcraft, and sorcery actually descends from the ideas that belong to these medieval sorcerers. And so a lot of the symbolism that we see, the geometric figures like pentagrams and the hexagrams and things like that, the Key of Solomon, all of these things that are well known in popular magical folk belief actually come from these medieval scholars who became sorcerer scholars, and they're the ones who ended up becoming the alchemists, seeking for things like the philosopher's stone. But medieval demonology was a big part of this. It was the idea that to gain power over heaven, you had to work your way up the food chain, as it were. And so first you had to be able to control demons. And so these medieval sorcerers had these ideas that they could create magical circles, summon and control demons, bind them to their will. And this really is the heart of a lot of what would later become the way we see demons to this day, including what we would consider to be the exorcism rituals that you see in places like the Catholic Church, which strangely enough owe more to medieval sorcery than they do to any true Christian belief.
And isn't it interesting that this all comes out of a Judeo-Christian experience?
Well, it does. They were
Yeah.
so focused on the idea of hell, and the demonic became such a huge part of what they did. And we were talking earlier about, again, this sort of sin-based commerce, and you said that that there are people who were exorcists who would travel around and do this. But the other thing that was very common, this is especially in the Middle Ages, is you would have traveling monks whose entire method of making a living was selling reliquaries, selling the bones of saints, essentially. And of course, this was almost entirely hucksterism. There's actually a wonderful scene in an old Robin Hood movie that I used to watch, where the monk is stopped on the road by the brigands, and he says, "Listen, I've got nothing on me but a bunch of chicken bones," and he pulls a necklace of chicken bones out and says, "This one's the toe bone of Saint Swithin's, and this one is this one." And it's very funny, but it was 100% true that this is what they would do. They would go into villages, and they would, for a few pennies, they would sell the bones of saints so that people could protect themselves from demonic forces and incur the protection of saints. It's fascinating.
Right. And we see this also in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, whenever we have the Pardoner's Tale, and he goes about explaining himself, and he was selling, of all things, which was very interesting, he was selling pig bones of people that were at one time Jewish, and he's selling bones of the animal that was so expressly forbidden within that culture.
And I am having a terrible mental blank here, but there was another practice where you could buy from the church, you could buy kind of an allowance, and there was a specific word for it.
Indulgences.
What is it?
It's an indulgence.
Indulgences, yes, of course,
Yeah.
where you could basically buy off future sins, which was
Sure.
absolutely crazy. So
Sure.
basically, you could get away with, with whether it was, sneaking around with the barmaid behind your wife's back or something like that. As long as you paid for indulgences, you
Right.
could actually pay off sins in advance. And again, to me, it's such a fascinating little bit of culture where this allowance of poor behavior became something that the church created a sort of a backdoor for, a loophole for,
Right.
and so it does make it hard to see the growing power of the church as a particularly morally upright
Right.
organization when they were so willing to look the other way for a few coins.
Right. And that what you said earlier about the commerce that's going on, that makes perfect sense because it is a commodity at this point, right? Getting into heaven is something that becomes something that you can buy or something that you can even sell, which is scary to think about. And when Martin Luther, who was a Catholic priest, he could not take anymore. He still loved his faith. He just had no idea why this was continuing, and not only why this was continuing, but why people were falling for it. And that is the reason why we had to have the Protestant Reformation come about. If that did not happen, I really don't know. I mean, we can speculate on this, but the Catholic faith was on a downward spiral here, and something needed to happen. But what is interesting, even whenever we have Martin Luther come into the scene, that still did not stop our interest in the demons and demonology, because it's going to be another 100 years later when we start having Milton come into play. So,
Of course.
yeah.
So let's see.
Oh, right
So
there.
these are two of the most significant sort of public treatises or public sort of expressions of the idea of hell and sin and what you actually have to look forward to after you die. So you have Dante Alighieri's Inferno and you have Milton's Paradise Lost. Now, Paradise Lost was primarily focused on hell itself, where the Inferno was one of the three books of what he called the Divine Comedy. But these were the first times that I think somebody in a literate sense versus a biblical scriptural sense actually described hell, described the tortures that you would face in hell, described the various demons and beings that you would encounter on your way to hell and what you could potentially do to avoid these things, and even actually started to give physical descriptions of the figure of the devil himself, Lucifer. And so these were a huge impact, and these are both epic poems, not prose works, but both very, very important. Now, of course, Dante was back in the 14th century, which was still very deep in the heart of the medieval period with superstition run wild, whereas Milton's was written in the early 17th or the late 17th century, and it was an age when we were just about to break through a barrier, just about to sort of break into an age where that medieval morality wouldn't have quite as much of a hold. So his was more so the last gasp in a way of that perspective.
Yeah. And I'm glad you put that up side by side, because that's exactly what I was talking about. So we have Dante writing in a very Italian Roman Catholic style, right? So this is his take on it. So we see a lot of the saints, we see the Virgin Mother. By the time we get to the Paradiso within that cycle of poems, and then when we go off to Milton, we already see the Protestant Reformation came around. We see a lot more focus on sin, and we see a lot of more focus on the burning and damnation of sinners. So we can look at these in different ways and to see how the idea of the devil and the idea of demons have moved and evolved with these different figures.
And Sarah, you just pointed out that these stories were basically a sort of a horror tale, a cautionary horror tale, and that they were also popular for their gruesomeness. And that's a true fact. And it is interesting because, of course, today, in the 21st century, horror is wildly popular. And why we find horror so popular is because we love to be frightened. And even then, the idea of this sort of dark universe, this dark and demonic underworld, while it was terrifying, it was also absolutely fascinating. And so stories of the horrors of hell were intriguing, they were fascinating, and they titillated people, to a certain degree. And so while nobody wanted to be subjected to the horrors of hell, they were certainly willing to listen to stories about it. And that, that fascination, again, we were talking about the fascination with the demonic, was something that was very, very common even at that early time.
Yeah. The interesting thing about the Dante's Inferno is that you see hell as stratified as well too,
Of
right?
course.
So the people that have lesser sins, they're up on the top. and life really isn't that bad up there. You know, it's kind of like if you were, I guess, if you were like in Miami without any suntan lotion. That's about what you'd be there. But what is interesting is by the time you get to the very depths of hell in Dante's Inferno, it is ice cold there. See, so we're not really thinking about that kind of stuff. So it's ice cold, and that's where we have Satan himself enthroned. And it's so cold that he can barely even move. And he has these great bat wings that just slowly kind of move. And in one of his hands, he holds Judas, you know, the great traitor. And while there are demons there, that's not the prime reason why we're taking a trip with Dante through hell, because it is a lesson to be learned every step of the way. We're learning from all these people that we meet along the way. But I will tell you what, whenever you come to Milton's Paradise Lost, this becomes much more of an everyman tale. You can really see yourself in the characters of not only Adam and Eve, but you can see yourself in the character of Satan as well too. Because whenever he says it's better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven, that is given as a morality code for you. Do you feel that way as well? I think it's one of the greatest works ever written. I truly love these works as well too. But especially somebody coming in from a very faithful point of view. But what's interesting though, as when we started out the show, was saying about Milton's Paradise Lost. This is whenever we see all these ancient Middle Eastern demons or Middle Eastern gods now become demons, where you have the, you know, Mammon, the god of money and everything, who was one time you were supposed to sacrifice children to him. So we see him now presiding in hell, and Satan's kingdom down there is called Pandemonium, and that's where we get our word pandemonium from.
Of course, and which literally means all the demonic. I mean,
Right.
the word literally means, you know, the demonic world. So these are also the first time that a specific hierarchy of both the angelic and the demonic become part of the common parlance, because these things are not from the Bible, but these medieval scholars and philosophers. I don't know if it was Dante who's the first one who established this, but this idea of the specific generals of hell and the tiers of angels that were there beneath God. And so when we talk about, I mean, most people have heard at least some of these terms: the seraphim, the cherubim, the archangels, the powers, things like that. These all came not from the Bible, and not even really from original Christian belief, but from the medieval scholars and philosophers who wanted to enact their own will on these worlds. And so they built these hierarchies. And interestingly enough, here is the one on the right, which is the demonic hierarchy, is inspired by the old Jewish Kabbalah, which is their system of interlocking sort of magical principles, which is not surprising when you understand where their original philosophies came from. Not that there was anything demonic about the Jewish belief, but that it was able to be transferred over into this later medieval idea of a demonic hierarchy, especially as even within that period, the Hebrew people were already being demonized. And so the idea that the Kabbalah would be representing an evil force to them is not surprising, because Jews were certainly already at that point subject to a tremendous amount of persecution. So you see these medieval branching trees that define the hierarchy of heaven, and it really is beginning to give us the idea of where the modern demon concept comes from. In fact, this is also a point when very shortly thereafter, the fear of witches began to rise. And this is the point where the first things like the Spanish Inquisition and the heresy trials would begin. Obsession with the devil and his demonic legions literally took over church doctrine, and heresy trials, executions, burnings, and things like this really became widespread. So this is what I would honestly call, even if there was no official determination for it, this was the age of fear, where fear of the demonic had literally taken over the public conscience.
Absolutely, yeah. You're right. It was Christian commentators, you know, from the first, second, third centuries that started to give these angels and demons hierarchy. We see a little bit of hinting at angelic hierarchy in some of the epistles, but it's not until later. But what is so interesting now that you said now we're finally up to the Inquisition. Now the devil is everywhere again, right? Just as we see Jesus of Nazareth performing exorcisms, he's walking down the road, and there's so many other people out there doing exorcisms as well too. Now we see almost 2,000 years later the same thing happening again, and of course. One of the reasons why people burned witches is to, not only to duplicate the flames of hell, but it was also believed that if you would burn the witch, and usually what happens after you burn the witch is you want to take these ashes and throw them into running water someplace, because it was believed that on the final day of the day of judgment, when Christ returns, that he would not be able to gather the ashes anymore. So that person was doomed to perpetual damnation simply from an act that you committed here on earth against your body.
Right, is keeping them from basically being called from their graves and rising at the last judgment.
Yep. And if you think about it, that's pretty gosh darn evil.
It is, and unfortunately, the good guys are not always the good guys. In fact, a fantastic line from one of my very favorite movies says that evil wears many masks, none so wicked as the mask of virtue. And it's very true. Unfortunately, this was a time when, the virtue had largely gone out of the church. And again, this is not in any way to say that there were not people of good faith, and there weren't even priests of true faith, but the church itself had become a business. It had become a powerful entity, and had, as so many governments do, and really they were a government at that point, they'd become so drunk on power that the actual virtue implicit in the faith was long gone from their day-to-day practice. But this had all at this point really come to a head, and I think that the heresy trials, the witch burnings, and things like that, which were happening on both sides of the Atlantic, certainly we had our share of them here as well, really was coming to a point of public intolerance. And this was right at the dawn of a very, very new age, which would come to be known as the Age of Reason. And the Age of Reason was the time when the pursuit of natural sciences, the idea that there were principles in existence that were not divinely controlled, that were simply controlled by the forces around you, the natural forces of the earth. We had people like Newton and Galileo, who were demonstrating these physical sciences, and many of them were considered to be heretics. And many of them, who came around at the end of this period, ended up dying for their beliefs. But this did change the face of the world, because the pursuit of science and the suppression of superstition and this religious madness actually began to take hold. This is largely in the end of the 17th century throughout the 18th century, when witch trials basically finally began to stop. There were a handful of witch trials and witch executions in the 18th century, but they became incredibly rare. And by the 19th century, this was considered to be comical. It was these superstitions were considered to be laughable nonsense and fodder mostly for children's stories, which is why stories of witches and ghosts and goblins at that point changed from being what was said in the pulpit to what was being told in children's books.
Absolutely. Although I think the last witch was burned to death in Scotland in 1727. So it's still pretty gosh darn late yet. I mean, so people are still having these worries and everything. And we're only talking about less than a decade after the witch trials up in Salem. So the world is changing. So we are now looking at the perspective not from the Catholic point of view or even the Christian point of view. Now the world has become that the human is now the priority in all this kind of stuff. So we have the rise of humanism, we have the rise of secular learning, and we really are coming now into what would be the modern age.
Yeah, and this is the point at which people like Darwin began to write about the idea of evolution again. Mm-hmm. That it wasn't necessarily God that made man in His image; that we had actually evolved from apes, which was a terrifying concept, and of course, again, incredibly controversial at that time. We had people, in the later Victorian era, like H.G. Wells, who began to write about things like free love and free will and living a life that was a secular life. And these concepts, while frightening to many, many people, didn't get them burned. It didn't get them necessarily imprisoned. Occasionally it did, but as a rule, again, things were changing. But these ideas of these diabolical forces had not gone away. They had sort of transferred at this point into the world of literature. And now, which is the rise, especially the 19th century, the rise of horror literature, the Gothic literature movement. This is where Frankenstein, interestingly enough, of course, came into it, which was published in, I think, 1818. And this was the first story that not only was a horror story, but it was a horror story that was not supernatural at all. It was about the horrors of science and the idea of a man playing God. So you were right on the edge of that age of reason. So if, again, a fascinating changeover in perspective. But that fascination with the demonic still began to rise. Now, usually in the form of these dark figures in these Gothic novels who were making pacts with the devil and selling their souls. So it was still good business, but it was business where you could, give a halfpence and get yourself a couple of pages of a good gory story.
Right. But again, we do still see our reflection in the shadowy mirror, don't we? We still see what happens whenever we play around with the dead things or with evil things. We have Goethe writing at this time in Germany, right? We have the Faustus coming about. What happens whenever you make deals with the devil? So we still have this idea there. So as you said, we are now mastering the world around us. We are now at the pinnacle that we've ever been. We have this human hubris that's coming out now, spilling all over the place. Yet we still have to look at ourselves in the mirror in which we see that Satan's reflection, because pretty soon we can fall into the same traps that he did. And just as he fell from grace, so too could humanity as a whole fall from that grace.
Well, it's interesting because the pendulum didn't swing all that far before it began to swing back. And it was in the mid to late Victorian era that something very, very new, but still kind of strangely familiar came into play. And that was the rise of Victorian spiritualism. And Victorian spiritualism was a brand new sort of a chapter in the idea of witchcraft in a way. You now had people talking to the dead. You had people, manifesting spirits, in the form of ectoplasm, telling the future. And this now became hugely popular again. But the difference, because this came on the tail of the Age of Reason, is that while this was often frowned upon and even sometimes scandalous, again, nobody was being imprisoned or burned at the stake, unless, of course, from time to time, as you can see, the title of this is Spirit Rapping Exposed, unless you were believed to be or somehow exposed to be a fraud. But other than that, this was considered socially a fairly popular form of entertainment. So the idea of this magical contact with the other world, with spirits, and even with demons and non-human spirits beyond the veil, had now actually evolved into a form of entertainment, which is a fascinating change from where it started. But seances, spirit boards, communication with the dead, it was actually a very fertile ground for stories of demons masquerading as harmless ghosts. And so the fear of the demonic continued to exist underneath the surface of this new spiritualism. And it's something that today I would be willing to bet you that a percentage of the people, even just watching tonight, would refuse to use something like a Ouija board on the idea that it was a gateway to letting demons into your life. And that's a concept that really gained its precedence largely during the Victorian era of spiritualism.
Yeah, every Halloween I put on a stage reproduction of a Victorian seance. And to this day, people are still against it because they believe that we're actually summoning demons rather than showing you what would happen in upper class parlors around the world, right? This was a time whenever you put your kids to bed, you invite the neighbors over, you have some wine, you have some cheese and crackers, and you communicate with the dead. That was just everyday life. That's falling still in the tradition of what happens around Halloween and everything. But what is also very cool about this is most of the mediums were women. So we still have the idea that the women are the ones that have this kind of connection to that other world, right? The kind of tenuous connection between our world and the other world. So that's happening too. But nobody's getting burned at the stake, like you said. People are still looking poorly upon it. But I got to point out though a couple things is that in the White House, Mary Todd Lincoln actually would have seances at the White House, of which President Abraham Lincoln would actually sit in on. And up until the 1980s, we know that Nancy Reagan herself had contacted astrologers about what to do next. So this idea of demons whispering in somebody's ear and controlling the outcome or showing you the way to the future is something that happened in our very White House.
Right. And the thing, too, is that the fear of the demonic being connected to these things is something that is still incredibly common within the more extreme chapters of the church. I mean, these are the ones that always clap back against these things, warn that the demons are, behind every spirit communication, hiding underneath every Ouija board. Now, obviously, there's still some people today, of less overtly religious belief who do think that, but the church is the one that pushes back stronger than anybody. So that old that old standby of the idea that demons are always waiting just beneath the surface of sort of perception to come and capture you really has not died out in the church. But at this point, we've sort of come to the edge of the 20th century. In the 20th century, even though spiritualism wasn't nearly as popular after the dawn of the 20th century, the idea of horror fiction was still very, very popular. And we began to see these ideas of the demonic becoming very, very popular in fiction. We had well-known writers like M.R. James, who was an amazing writer of ghost stories, in his story Casting the Runes, which is a truly terrifying story, soon afterwards made into the film Night of the Demon. Witches became very popular in cinema at that point. But another, and I think very important element of the sort of change from the world of science and magic and the way they intermingled was H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft wrote demonic fiction in a way, but it wasn't supernatural so much as it was science fiction. He came up with the idea that somewhere out beyond human perception, that there was another dimension, not something that was overtly supernatural, but something that was another species that lived outside of our sort of realm of perception, but that with the right rituals and the right devices, that door could be opened, and that these creatures, more ancient than us, that lived out there in this sort of other existence, were constantly hungering to come back into this world and to take it over, which is both a absolutely terrifying concept, but also one that harkens right back to early demonic belief about these these powerful demigods that exist and that in a way hunger for human blood. And that's something we again talked a lot about in our vampire episode. But one particular story that fascinated me, and I read it when I was a teenager, and it's always fascinated me, was a H.P. Lovecraft story called From Beyond. And in this story, a gentleman had created a device which was basically shown a specific kind of light from this device. And when the light was turned on, it actually shone through our reality and into this other reality, and you could see the creatures that surrounded you, these dark predatory creatures. So it was not only a terrifying story, but all the more terrifying because when he used the light, not only could you see the creatures, but now they could see you. And I thought that this was just truly terrifying. But this was now demons and science coming together and becoming sort of merged together with this early 20th century fiction.
Very cool. Very cool.
Now, the idea of exorcism, which was something, of course, we knew all about, in earlier days, now also jumped madly into the realm of entertainment with probably the most terrifying film of the 1970s, and one that is considered legendary to this day, which would be The Exorcist. And The Exorcist, I think in many ways, we have to give this film credit for almost creating the modern concept of demonic possession. The idea about how we believe that the possessed behave, about the process. And so this, which was said to be inspired by a true story, but written by William Peter Blatty, this story literally changed the face of horror cinema. It was more graphic than anything that anyone had ever seen. It was considered truly terrifying. People threw up or fainted in the cinema, the special effects, but this changed the face of people's perception of modern demonic activity. And I think today, almost everything that we think of as demonic can be seen in that film. I think that is really the one that set the stage. It was kind of the way Dracula created the modern image of vampires. I believe that The Exorcist created the modern image of demonic possession.
Even the voices, everything, even now, whenever we watch the ghost hunter shows on television, if there's a demon presence through that spirit box, is that gravelly voice, right? So we have now connected all the dots and shows that, from the very, very beginning, when we were dealing with these Middle Eastern gods, now have become demonized, now to the point that they're coming through our spirit boxes. 5,000 years later.
So, folks, we're just about at the 9 o'clock hour, but if no one minds, we're going to continue on for a couple more minutes because I still have a few ideas I want to get through before we sign off for the evening. So we're going to run a little bit over tonight because I want to talk about how the exorcism and the dawn of sort of modern popular demonic ideas has crossed over into popular culture, which it has in a truly, truly astounding way. So after The Exorcist, which really paved the way for the idea of demonic fiction, fascination with the demonic spawned an entire genre. And so over the next few years, you began to get films like in the with the early 1970s, I think it was 1973 or 1974, the Amityville Horror. Just a couple years after that, a film called The Demon Murder Case was made, based on supposedly a true story, which took place in Brookfield, Connecticut. The Amityville Horror, of course, being supposedly based on a true story in Amityville, New York. Here, just about a decade ago, we had The Conjuring, which is based supposedly on a true story, taking place in Harrisville, Rhode Island. And all of these were classic demonic possession films. And you can see, so over the next few decades, these demonic stories, almost always claiming to be based on something true, really, really took off. And within the last decade, one of the things that I think is truly fascinating is something that had never happened before, is the creation of a shared universe of supposedly based on true story demonic films. The Conjuring universe, it's now called. Just the same way we have movies like films like The Avengers, which have this whole big interconnected universe. We have for the first time ever this interconnected universe of demonic activity. And just as The Avengers is about superheroes, in a weird sort of way, the Conjuring universe has created this idea of sort of demon hunting superheroes in the figures of Ed and Lorraine Warren, who of course were very real people and lived here in Connecticut. I believe they lived in Monroe, Connecticut, if I'm not mistaken. So we have these real life demonologists and demon hunters who now are the stars of this entire series, although they're not in every one of the films, but this whole series of interconnected stories about demonic possession and the dangers of it. And this is something that never, I think, has happened before, where we basically taken these real life investigators and turned them into these superheroes with these incredible powers that can defeat basically, any demon, usually demons that even the church is not willing to tackle in these films. And so I think it'd be interesting to talk about the Warrens for a few minutes and the legacy that they've left behind.
Oh yeah, I think they're great. I mean, look, they're great characters in those movies. Even though it's really no reflection on who they were as actual people, I think that they're great. I mean, my daughter likes them as characters, in the movies. But yeah, I think that is also a telltale sign about what's going on in our culture as well. We don't necessarily need the church now to fight our battles, right? Somebody who is capable of having that open relationship with God themselves can do things that only the church was once able to do. And somebody also commented on here, boy, those New England states. It's also hearkening back to what happened up there during the Salem witch trials, right? All that evil that happened up there is now being kind of resurrected again, but now it's being handled quite differently than the way it was 300 years ago.
It is, and it's interesting too, because I mean, there's no question that up here, in the Northeast, we do seem to have a little bit of a more pride and more sort of investment in our supernatural stories. I think maybe it's because of the age of this part of the country. We're the oldest settled European settled part of the Americas, and so we do take a lot of pride in these stories, and I think it's one of the reasons why they take root here. But what you said about the Warrens earlier, I think is certainly worth saying, and we may sort of ruffle a few feathers with this, but the truth is that yes, it's very accurate to say that who Ed and Lorraine Warren were in their real life and who they were in the movies are not necessarily the same thing. The real life Ed and Lorraine Warren did have literally hundreds and hundreds of cases of investigation of psychic phenomena, hauntings, and demonic activity. However, the way it's portrayed in the films doesn't always reflect what happened in real life. Not only are the films obviously fictionalized in terms of the degree of special effects and the monsters coming out of the walls and things like that. But also, for instance, if you listen to the Perron family, who are the heart of the Conjuring, original Conjuring film, they will tell you that they did not, in fact, invite the Warrens to come. The Warrens effectively invited themselves in when they got wind of the story and held a seance in the house. And the Perrons say that after the seance took place, that everything got worse, and that the Warrens did not defeat the evil in the house. That in fact, that their involvement, unfortunately, was negative to the house. And these kind of things, unfortunately, are true. Ed and Lorraine Warren themselves, I'm not going to try and cast aspersions on their character or anything like that, but it is very true, I think, to say at least that they exaggerated a great deal of their involvement in some of these cases for the sake of publicity. And I think one of the most obvious and sometimes difficult of these would be, probably their big starring attraction, which is the Annabelle doll. The Annabelle doll, of course, which has been for many, many years on display at their museum, which in the films is this, porcelain doll, which is quite ugly and also very frightening looking, but in real life, as you can see here, was just a fairly ordinary, if large, Raggedy Ann doll that does not have any particularly frightening characteristics about it. What fascinates me about the Annabelle doll, when you consider its reputation, the Annabelle doll has allegedly been blamed for both demonic possession, a slew of violent attacks leading to injuries, and even apparently said to be responsible for 2 near-death experiences. And while that's pretty terrifying as a legacy for a possessed doll, no matter what the doll itself looks like, it's a little bit more distressing when you realize that this doll is frequently taken on tour. And so in their actual museum, they have this framework that is designed to protect the doll. It's supposedly church-blessed glass. They've got this tarot card of the devil pinned to the outside. I'm not quite sure why that would be. And a warning saying, positively do not open. So one has to realistically ask, is it safe to put such an object on public display and to carry it around to conventions so that the curious can gawk at it? And so what I find when I think about that is I find myself asking, so I feel like there are 2 options here. One is that it would be an irresponsible act, just looking for publicity, to take something, if you truly believe it is that haunted, to take it out and show it to the public when it is supposed to be so potentially dangerous. And the other would be that perhaps they are aware that it is not quite as dangerous as they have, as it has been purported to be. So I don't know. Is it that the Annabelle doll isn't really haunted, but it makes good money? Or is it the Annabelle doll is really haunted and they don't care because it makes good money? I'm not really sure which of these 2 things it is, but it does, to me, at least cast a pall of doubt over it. And unfortunately, I think that is something that at the end of the day is kind of the crux of the modern demonic obsession that you see in paranormal media. And I think that this obsession or infatuation with the demonic has really gotten out of control. Virtually all of the ghost hunting shows now focus very, very heavily on the demonic because I just don't think that ghosts are considered dangerous enough anymore. They're not sexy enough. The idea that the demonic is just so much more dangerous and therefore has more allure to them, which is something we talked about earlier with the early medieval people reading reading the Inferno or reading Paradise Lost. The idea of the titillation of the fear of the demonic. It's good money. It's good business.
It is. And as a child of the 1970s who went to Catholic school, we were told by the nuns that demons cannot possess you unless you allow a door within yourself to be open and to come on in. So I think that's the thing that we have to keep in mind as well, too. But again, when we talk about this Annabelle thing, bringing it out, don't they also get kind of worried about the idea of intentions that are projected onto this thing, right? Everybody and their brother that are looking at this thing thinks it has a demon in it. Wouldn't you assume that if you believe in those kind of things to begin with, that is opening up a highway for the demonic activity to go into the thing?
It certainly would seem so. So I mean, as I say, at the end of the day, I'm not suggesting that the doll is or isn't haunted or that in fact demons do or do not exist. I think that the jury is out on that. If demons exist on some level, I think there's certainly a world of possibility. I do not claim to have the answers to all of these things, but I do believe that the obsession with the demonic, which has now become, sort of stock and barrel for the entire sort of ghost hunting community and is very popular popularized, unfortunately, by some of the television shows. I think that it is not only dishonest, but I also think that it's unhealthy. And I think that this it's a trend in the paranormal field that I look forward to ending, or sort of reaching the point where the bubble bursts, because I just don't think that it really has the bearing on paranormal investigation that the field was intended to investigate.
Yeah.
I think walking into a supposedly haunted building, taunting the alleged demons within, and then claiming to get scratched and slapped around is not particularly beneficial to the paranormal field by and large. So that would be my final word on that one.
And I do a lot of Bigfoot conferences whenever I hear people doing entire lectures on Bigfoot being a demon as well, too. So it's pervasive.
Yeah. So, well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for hanging on for a few extra minutes for us to get through the rest of this. Again, I hope that we gave you some insight into sort of the world of the demonic, and the parts that might be legitimate and the parts that may not, and how we got to this place where we do seem to have demons around every corner. But just want to let you know before we go for the evening that next week we're going to take a little break. We're just going to do a week off to sort of get our head together. We'll be back in 2 weeks. I believe that's the 21st, if I'm not mistaken, with a brand new episode. Next week we'll probably run one of our fun old episodes. So if there's something that you haven't seen, we'll run that next week for you. And so we just want to thank you as always for joining us this evening, Ron. As always, fantastic conversation.
Absolutely love it.
So guys, you have a wonderful night, and we will see you in 2 weeks again live for the next episode of Monday Night Monsters. And until then, keep your religious icons handy, and don't use your Ouija board. So good night, guys.